Memorial Day. Obviously not a day that is exciting, but it is a day where we honor the fallen. And I just want to remind everybody, it's not Veterans Day. There's another day for that. This is a day where we honor the fallen. And we talk about heroes so often. These stories. Joining me now, James Fenelon. He's a former paratrooper, which we'll get to in a moment. And he wrote a book called Angels Against the Sun. It's about World War II and these guys that just did amazing things. James, I finally sat down and started watching Band of Brothers with my sons. And these guys are getting ready to jump out of the plane day before D-Day, and everything's going off. And they look at me and they say, "Dad, you were a Marine. Did you ever do that?" And I told them, "No, son, I never jumped out of a plane." And the disappointment on their face was just palpable. Like they wanted me to be one of those freaking hero guys. But I got to tell you, I'm still glad I didn't have to jump out of a plane.
Well, I can appreciate the distinction. I'll be honest with you. I'm glad I never had to storm a beach. So, we're all cut out for our individual roles, right?
Can you explain to people who've never done it, what is it like? I mean, in peacetime, it doesn't look like something I would be interested in at all, let alone, you read these World War II stories like the one you wrote a book about. I don't think I would be able to do it. I think I would just fall over dead from fright.
Well, I think, the good news in the case of what we're talking about here, static line jumps, and particularly in World War II, they're not that different from static line jumps today. Generally speaking, you've served in the military, so you know that a lot of times what you're in the middle of doing is actually comes down to training and muscle memory. And I think in the case of jumping out of an airplane, you're usually more interested in not being the guy that's the slowest one out the door or getting in any other people's way. So by the time you realize what's going on, 9 times out of 10, you're outside the aircraft and you're counting to 4 and making sure that your parachute actually opens. And, also in the case of static line, you're jumping fairly low, so you don't really have a lot of time to enjoy the ride, so to speak.
Okay. Would you rather jump low than high?
Well, I think it all depends on what you're doing. And I think that, that's another interesting thing, right? Similar to your own experience of the way you get into combat is the commute, right? And so same thing with kind of jumping out of an airplane. That's just where the day's work starts. And so I think in the case of a mass airborne operation, like you were talking about the Band of Brothers example in Normandy, the idea being that the lower you jump in those kind of circumstances, the less time the enemy has to shoot at you. Some of the pictures we're looking at here are for more clandestine ways of getting in, so to speak. So the advantages of jumping higher there are that you're not going to be noticed as much, right? And so I think it just kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish when you're actually getting on the ground. And in the case of the 11th Airborne in the book or the Band of Brothers that we experienced, we're talking about, hundreds of guys in the air at the same time. The longer you're in the air, the more chance you have of steering into somebody else and getting entangled.
Ugh. So is that more of a concern, getting entangled, than getting shot? Don't get me wrong, I know getting shot is a top concern, but you really don't want to drift into somebody?
Yeah, especially in those mass attack situations, it's a lot harder to hit a falling object, I think, when you're shooting at it than people might expect. And so I do think in those circumstances, the bigger risk initially, at least anyway, is getting entangled or injury on the jump itself.
That brings us to the 11th Airborne, who you just mentioned. Courtesy of that great HBO series, Band of Brothers, people are aware of Easy Company. They're aware of what happened in Europe. But when people think of the Pacific, they mainly try to think about the Marines, even though the Army was extremely involved in the Pacific portion. And as much as it hurts me to give them credit, they were involved. What did the 11th Airborne do?
Yeah, so it's a great observation. There were a number of Army units that were engaged in the Pacific. The 11th Airborne arrived a little late into the campaign. In October of 1944 is when they started making their way into the Philippines, and they participated in the liberation of the Philippines. They started by landing on the island of Leyte, and then later participating in the Luzon campaign, which is the largest island in the Philippines. And interestingly enough, they in that particular operation landed both amphibiously, part of the unit coming ashore in Amtraks and landing craft, similar to what the Marines did on other island campaigns. And then the other part of the unit actually airdropped in by a parachute further inland to meet up with that unit and then push their way up into Manila, which was some of the largest urban combat in the Pacific theater.
Landing in a jungle environment like the Philippines, Doesn't that add, and you're gonna have to forgive me, I never jumped out of a plane, and I'm never going to, James. Doesn't that add an extra element of risk, just having been in the jungle, specifically Thailand's jungle? I couldn't see the sky. I don't know where I would come landing in on a parachute.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of one of the challenges, I think, of those kind of operations in the Pacific. To your point, the islands are small, they're heavily vegetated. In the case, though, of the jump south of Manila, they did have the benefit of finding a very large plateau that had been largely cultivated into farmland, which kind of facilitated that drop zone, if you will. So they were dropping near the jungle in that case, but certainly the guys that had landed on the coast and were working their way up a narrow road to link up with those guys who jumped in were dealing with some of that thicker vegetation on their way inland.
The book is Angels Against the Sun, a World War II saga of grunts, grit, and brotherhood. James, I want to give you the final word on this. Memorial Day, what's it mean to you?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think you started off with the observation that today's the day where we take time to reflect upon those who had fallen in combat. And I also think it's an opportunity to reflect some of the values and traits that we can learn from their sacrifice, right? Specifically endurance, self-reliance, adaptability to your environment and your conditions, and of course teamwork. And those are all things that I think are just as relevant and important for us to remember, as well as the sacrifices of those who died in service.
I have great news. If you enjoyed that, I have a YouTube channel you can subscribe to. Whatever I do, it'll be right there on YouTube. So go subscribe today.